In our video, we will be discussing how to find exact values of trig functions. Let's first start off with some definitions. First is a reference angle. A reference angle is an angle located between the terminal side and the closest x-axis. It is always between 0 and 90 degrees. Here's an example of one. This is 200 degrees, and the reference angle would be 20 degrees because it is between the terminal side and the closest x-axis. The second definition is coterminal angles. These are angles that end in the same place. These angles are multiples of 360 degrees away from each other. Example of this would be negative 15 degrees and 345 degrees and negative 375 degrees. The last definition is a radian. It is a unit of angle whose arc length is equal in length to the radius. When talking about radians, we can talk about converting radians into degrees and converting degrees into radians. So when you want to convert from radians to degrees, you would multiply that value by 180 degrees over pi. For example, here is 5 pi over 12. You would multiply 5 pi over 12 by 180 degrees over pi. The pi's ultimately cancel out, and 12 can be put into 180 degrees 15 times. Then you would multiply 5 by 15, which gives you 75 degrees. You can also convert degrees into radians. You would multiply the degree by pi over 180. So here's an example of 120 degrees. You would multiply 120 degrees by pi over 180. 120 and 180 can be simplified into 2/3, and you would keep the pi there, which gives you the answer of 2 pi over 3. When trying to find exact values of trig functions, here is an important table to know. So here is a table of trig functions, and instead of memorizing it, here is a hand trick. So let's say you wanted to find the angle of cosine 45. So you put the finger down for the desired angle, and for cosine you'd look above the finger that you would just put down, and you see it's 2, so you take the square root of the fingers and put it over 2. And then if you want to find sine, you would look below the finger that you just put down, and you would do the square root of those figures, which again, square root of 2 over 2. The table of trig functions is important because these give you the exact values of trig functions. Here is another thing to know. These are 4 quadrants. These 4 quadrants tell you whether the trig function is positive or negative. This is important because signs are important. So in quadrant 1, this means all trig functions are positive. Sine, cosine, tangent, they're reciprocals. That means all of them are positive because x and y are positive. In quadrant 2, sine is only positive because y is positive. In quadrant 3, tan is positive because x and y are negative. And in quadrant 4, cosine is positive because x is positive. And here are some helpful ways of remembering where the quadrants are. So you can use all shark teeth cut, animals should teach class, and always salt the caramel. Now that we know all of this, we can start finding exact values of trig functions. On a test or quiz, you may be given, find the value of a trig function given the terminal side. So, for example, we have cotangent, and the terminal side that we are given is negative 3 and square root of 7. So we know, because we're given the terminal side, that this is the x value and this is the y value. So just remember that cotangent is x over y. So now we can just plug in those values that we know. So we know that x is negative 3 and y is square root of 7, but we cannot have a square root in the denominator, as you can see by this little note. So we have to multiply the top and the bottom by square root of 7. So this ultimately will cancel out the square root and just leave it with 7. And then the top will be negative 3 square root of 7. So in other cases that aren't cotangent or tangent, where you would also need to find the r value, here are some steps. So you have to look at the terminal angle and see what it gives you for the x and y value. Then look at the trig function which you're trying to determine. So whether it be cosine, sine, tangent, secant, etc. And then if it's sine, cosine, cosecant, or secant, you need to find the r value. You can find this through the Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but it would be, in this case, x squared plus y squared equals r squared. And then you would plug in the x or y or r values into the desired trig function, and that's it. Another problem you may be given on a test or quiz is finding the exact trig value, and they just give you an angle like this. So right here we are given tan negative 19 pi over 4. So here are some steps to follow to figure out this problem. So the first thing you need to do is find the reference angle, which I had done right here. As you can see, I had highlighted pi over 4. And pi over 4 we know from looking at our little chart here is 45 degrees. So we know now the reference angle is 45 degrees. Next thing you need to do is calculate the value using the table or the hand rule. So we can look at the table and we know that pi over 4 or 45 degrees of tan is 1. Perfect, right here. Next we need to find where the angle, aka falls, to determine the sign. By falls, I mean where it falls in the quadrants that we had talked about before. So we know that the reference angle is 45 degrees, but we need to multiply 45 by negative 19. So in my calculator, I had done this, but I didn't do negative 19, I just did positive 19. But the angle would be negative 855 degrees. Now, I had already done this out, and I know that it falls in the quadrant 3. So as we know from our little sayings, all shark teeth cut, we know that it falls in the tangent quadrant, and the tangent quadrant means that tangent is positive. So the final answer for this would be positive 1.